Very quickly, we figured out he's dead, and it turned into a bit of this is a crime scene to some degree. CSI, crime scene wildlife.
Something in the Everglades had started eating apex predators, and for months, nobody could tell what it was. Not an alligator, not a panther, not anything on the list of suspects researchers had spent decades building. Something that had been there the entire time, coiled in the same black water, folded into the same drowned grass, walked past on the trail without a second glance. In the spring of 2021, a research team tracking invasive Burmese pythons through Picayune Strand State Forest in southwest Florida started losing signals. Not the pythons moving out of range, not equipment failure. The transmitters kept transmitting, clean, steady, perfectly on schedule. The pythons wearing them simply stopped existing. When biologists finally traced one signal to its source, it wasn't in the swamp at all. It was inside a hospital. Zoo Miami's animal hospital, to be exact, where an X-ray technician found something that made no sense on the screen. A python's spine, curled neatly inside the stomach of another snake, a transmitter still blinking somewhere in the coils. This is the story of how a war nobody was supposed to win started quietly turning, and about the small, overlooked predator now leading the charge in a fight most scientists had already written off. What the evidence shows isn't just one animal's revenge. It's a pattern spreading across the entire food chain, involving animals nobody had ever put on the suspect list, and it's still being counted today. The signals go dark. Picayune Strand sits inland from Naples. A patchwork of cypress domes, wet prairie, and old failed subdivisions the state has spent 2 decades trying to undevelop and restore to wetland. It's remote enough that a research team can spend a full day in chest-deep water and see no one else. In 2021, Ian Bartoszek and his team at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida were running exactly the kind of study that never makes headlines. Surgically implanting radio transmitters into juvenile Burmese pythons, then tracking their movement to map how far young snakes travel and how many of them survive their first year. It should have produced spreadsheets. Instead, it produced a mystery. One tracked python's signal simply stopped moving. No decline in activity, no slow taper, just a hard stop, the kind that usually means death. When the team pushed through sawgrass and standing water to the coordinates, there was nothing. No carcass, no blood, no drag marks, just a faint, steady pulse, broadcasting from somewhere that wasn't the python anymore. This wasn't actually the first time it had happened, and that detail matters. Records the team compared afterward showed a nearly identical case back in August 2020. A separate juvenile python's transmitter had gone dark under the same circumstances, tracked to what researchers later confirmed, through their partnership with Zoo Miami, was another cottonmouth. At the time, it had been treated as a one-off oddity. Nobody connected it to anything larger. It would take a second, then a third case before the pattern became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. And within the same year, researchers logged a third confirmed loss, another tagged juvenile whose signal led straight back to a cottonmouth's stomach. 3 separate transmitters, 3 separate pythons, one shared ending. The May 2021 case was the one that made it undeniable. The signal led the team to an adult Florida cottonmouth in Big Cypress National Preserve. The snake was captured, sedated, and transported to Zoo Miami, where veterinary staff who had originally implanted the transmitter now watched an X-ray reveal it sitting inside a completely different animal. The cottonmouth measured a little over 2 feet, not a giant by snake standards, smaller in total length than some of the pythons it was suspected of preying on. It had swallowed a same-species predator's prey whole, transmitter included, and kept moving through the swamp as if nothing unusual had happened. Bartoszek would later describe the moment as one of the strangest of his career. Not because a snake had eaten a snake, which happens constantly in nature, but because of exactly which snake it was, and how casually it seemed to be doing something researchers had never built into their models of the ecosystem at all. To understand why that mattered so much, you have to understand exactly how far past hope the Everglades had already fallen. An ecosystem with no defenses. Burmese pythons are not supposed to be in Florida. Their entire evolutionary history unfolded 4,000 miles away, in the river deltas and mangrove forests of Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Landscapes shaped by millions of years of coexistence, none of that history crossed the Pacific with them. The exotic pet trade brought thousands of hatchling pythons into South Florida through the 1980s and 1990s, sold cheap in strip mall pet shops, to buyers who had no idea a docile 2-foot snake could become a 16-foot, 100-pound animal within a few years. Many owners, overwhelmed, released them into canals and wetlands near Miami. But the event that most researchers now consider the true tipping point was Hurricane Andrew in August 1992. The Category 5 storm tore through South Miami-Dade County and destroyed several commercial animal facilities, including at least one python breeding operation, scattering an unknown number of animals directly into the wetlands bordering Everglades National Park. What had been a slow trickle of releases became, almost overnight, a breeding population with no way to be recalled. For the next decade, nobody could prove how badly the snakes were reshaping the ecosystem, until a 2012 study changed that permanently. Biologist Michael Dorcas of Davidson College, working with the U.S. Geological Survey, compared road survey data from before 2000 against surveys conducted between 2003 and 2011, covering nearly 35,000 miles of nighttime driving through the park. The results, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, were stark enough to reshape how wildlife agencies talked about invasive species entirely. Raccoon sightings had fallen 99.3%. Opossum sightings, 98.9%. Bobcats, 87.5%. White-tailed deer sightings had dropped by more than 94% in the areas pythons had occupied longest. Marsh rabbits and foxes weren't seen at all. Not reduced, just absent from the data completely. Separate necropsy work compounded the picture. Researchers combing through python digestive tracts across the study period recovered the remains of 58 different bird species, some of them migratory songbirds that had flown thousands of miles from as far as Canada only to winter in a Florida marsh that was no longer safe for them. That single study became the foundational evidence behind the federal government's 2012 decision to list Burmese pythons as injurious wildlife under the Lacey Act, banning their importation and interstate transport. Florida followed with bounty programs, trained detection dogs, and eventually a public removal event now known as the Florida Python Challenge. Behind the scenes, researchers layered in even more ambitious detection tools. Environmental DNA sampling that could flag a python's genetic trace in water it had merely passed through, acoustic monitoring rigs, and thermal imaging drone flights, with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers eventually contributing resources of its own. None of it slowed the snakes down in any measurable way. Researchers, including University of Florida ecologist Frank Mazzotti, who has studied the invasion for more than 2 decades, have been candid for years that current population estimates run into the tens of thousands, with some assessments suggesting the true number could be far higher across the snake's full range, which now stretches well beyond the park itself. Mazzotti has described watching the ecosystem being consumed in real time, telling colleagues in the field that Florida simply didn't have a predator built to stop it. By the time Bartoszek's transmitters started going dark, the assumption inside the research community wasn't just that the pythons were winning. It was that nothing in the Everglades had the tools to stop them at all, eliminating the impossible. Before the cottonmouth was confirmed, Bartoszek's team ran through every plausible predator the Everglades had to offer, and each one failed to fit the evidence. An alligator was the obvious first guess. Alligators are documented, opportunistic predators of pythons, and had already been recorded killing them elsewhere in prior studies. But alligator kills leave unmistakable trauma. Crushed bone, torn tissue, a death roll's signature spiral wounds. There was none of that here. No wounds, no struggle marks in the mud. Just an animal that had vanished whole. A Florida panther was considered next. An endangered, elusive cat with a small but recovering population in this exact region, known to take down prey many times its own weight. But panthers kill with a precise bite to the skull or spine, and they leave claw marks and drag trails. Nothing matched. Black bears, opportunistic and powerful enough to overpower almost anything in the swamp, were ruled out for a simpler reason. No bear swallows a 13-foot animal whole. Nothing in Florida does that. Nothing anyone had ever documented anyway. Even large constrictors already known to the area were briefly floated and dismissed. Florida has its own smaller population of established invasive boas and other python species competing for the same territory, and cannibalism among large snakes isn't unheard of. But nothing in the size or behavior profile matched what the transmitters were describing. That was the wall the team kept hitting. Every serious predator candidate in the Everglades food chain either left evidence that wasn't there or was physically incapable of doing what the data clearly showed had happened. Total ingestion, zero external trauma, and a live, active predator continuing to move through the swamp afterward like nothing had occurred. So they did the only thing left to do. They pointed cameras at the coordinates where signals had died and waited. The answer in the leaf litter. What the cameras eventually confirmed had already been hiding in plain sight in the scientific literature. Researchers just hadn't connected it to this specific war yet. The Florida cottonmouth, Archistrodon conanti, is a heavy-bodied, semi-aquatic pit viper that has occupied these exact cypress domes and drowned prairies for thousands of years, long before anyone imported a single python. Most people who encounter one know it only as a snake to back away from, coiled, jaw gaping white in warning, a threat to step around on the trail. That reputation, it turns out, radically undersold what the animal was capable of. Cottonmouths are documented ophiophages, snake eaters by evolutionary design, confirmed to prey on at least 27 other snake species, including members of their own species. That specialization long predates the python invasion. It isn't a new behavior the cottonmouth learned. It's simply that a python-shaped gap opened up on a menu the cottonmouth had already been running for millennia. And the snake filled it without hesitation. A 2021 case study co-authored by Bartoszek and USGS researchers, published in Herpetological Review, documented the mechanics directly. A cottonmouth measuring roughly 3 feet total length recorded consuming a juvenile python tail first, working the entire body down its throat in a slow, methodical sequence. A second cottonmouth examined in the same study measured between 34 and 42 inches, snout to tail, and had swallowed a python of nearly matching length. Proof the first case wasn't a fluke, but a repeatable, specific hunting behavior. A follow-up study from the USGS's Big Cypress research team, titled, fittingly, Natives Bite Back, expanded the picture further, documenting at least 3 separate cottonmouth predation events on tracked juvenile pythons, alongside kills by alligators and, strikingly, one attempted predation event by a hispid cotton rat, a rodent barely larger than a mouse, attempting to subdue a python nearly its own body length. In one especially extreme case, researchers calculated the predator-to-prey size ratio at 106%. The python was actually larger than the animal that killed it, the most extreme size mismatch ever documented for python predation in Florida. The mechanism behind it explains how an ambush predator built for 6-inch fish and frogs can take down something so much bigger. Cottonmouths, like all pit vipers, have heat-sensing pit organs positioned between their eyes and nostrils, capable of detecting infrared radiation with extraordinary precision. A python, even one that runs cold-blooded, generates enough residual thermal contrast after basking or digesting to register clearly against the surrounding water. Darkness doesn't matter. Camouflage doesn't matter. In a cottonmouth's own territory, at night, in still black water, there is functionally nowhere for a smaller python to hide. Their strategy against dangerous or unfamiliar prey is disciplined rather than reckless. One precise, venomous strike, then retreat and wait. The cottonmouth's hemotoxic venom breaks down tissue and blood cells from the inside, and against a python, still too young to have developed the crushing strength of an adult, the outcome typically isn't in doubt. It just takes minutes. An entire coalition acting alone. The cottonmouth wasn't fighting a lone war, and the deeper Bartoszek's team dug into their own tracking data, the clearer that became. Buried in the same telemetry dataset that revealed the cottonmouth kills was a second, previously unassembled pattern. Of the juvenile pythons the study tracked, several had been killed by American alligators, including one taken by a gator measuring just 9 feet, an unremarkable, mid-sized animal doing what alligators have done in these wetlands for tens of millions of years. They hadn't ceded ground to the invasion. They'd simply never stopped taking it back, quietly, off camera, long before anyone thought to check. Florida is the only place on Earth where alligators share territory with a second crocodilian, the American crocodile. And researchers have separately documented crocodiles preying on pythons too, meaning the invaders now face not one, but 2 armored reptilian ambush predators in the same stretch of coastline. Then, in June 2021, a camera trap positioned at a python nest in Big Cypress National Preserve captured something with no precedent anywhere in the herpetological record. A 20-pound bobcat, a species whose own numbers in parts of the Everglades had collapsed by nearly 90% under python predation pressure, according to that same 2012 Dorcas study, was recorded repeatedly returning to an unguarded nest belonging to a 14-foot female over several days, feeding on, trampling, and catching dozens of eggs. When the nesting female eventually returned, researchers documented what their published study called the first recorded instance of active nest defense by a Burmese python anywhere, and the first ever photographic evidence of a native mammal preying on python eggs. It was, in the researchers' own account, a genuine double first. Nobody had ever seen either half of that confrontation before. Owls and hawks added a third front, picking off juvenile pythons from exposed basking spots at dusk and dawn, a form of predation that carries outsized weight precisely because it happens early. A python killed at 18 inches never grows into the animal capable of swallowing a full-grown deer. a behavior Bartoszek's own team had separately documented and photographed for the first time in December 2022. Black bears and Florida panthers rounded out the mammal side of the list, both confirmed taking pythons at multiple points across the study area. And the reptile world offered one more surprise. In 2023, researchers recorded the first known case of a Florida king snake, itself a well-known predator of venomous snakes, swallowing a hatchling python whole, while the federally threatened Gulf Coast indigo snake, one of the longest native snakes in North America, has also turned up on the confirmed list of python predators, an animal already fighting for its own survival, somehow finding room to push back against the invader replacing it. Pit vipers in the leaf litter, alligators and crocodiles in the water, bobcats at the nest, raptors in the canopy, king snakes and indigo snakes in the grass, bears and panthers in the brush. None of them coordinated, none of them aware of each other. Every one of them simply doing what millions of years of evolutionary pressure built them to do: defend territory from something that doesn't belong in it. The math that still isn't on their side. Here's the number that keeps every one of these researchers from calling it a victory. A single female Burmese python can lay between 12 and dozens of eggs per clutch. The largest documented clutches push past 80. She reaches reproductive maturity in as few as 3 years and can live for decades, laying new clutches nearly every season. The Conservancy's own removal data makes the scale brutally concrete. Female pythons captured during a recent breeding season averaged roughly 70 eggs each, with the largest carrying well over 100. Run that math forward even once, and it becomes obvious that killing most of a clutch still isn't the same as killing the clutch. The scale of the human response has grown dramatically, and it still isn't enough. The Conservancy of Southwest Florida's Scout Snake program, built around roughly 40 radio-tagged male pythons with names like Vladi, Christopher, and Steve that lead researchers directly to breeding females before eggs can be laid, has now removed more than 1,750 pythons weighing over 53,000 pounds combined since the program began in 2013, spanning more than 11,500 feet of snake. Nearly 2 miles of invasive python laid end-to-end, including 277 breeding females intercepted before they could nest. The average snake the team pulls from the field still runs about 12.6 feet long, and the largest Burmese python ever confirmed in Florida, nearly 19 feet, was found in Big Cypress National Preserve in 2023, tracked down the same way almost every record-breaking capture happens now. A scout snake led hunters straight to her. A single recent season alone accounted for more than 4 tons of snake and over 4,000 eggs pulled from the ecosystem before they could hatch. Statewide, Florida's broader removal programs, including the annual Python Challenge, have together taken thousands more. Frank Mazzotti's long-standing assessment remains unchanged. Even this is barely scratching the surface, because pythons are concealment specialists on a level that borders on supernatural, capable of vanishing within feet of a trained observer and occupying vast stretches of wetland no removal team can ever fully search on foot. And yet, every documented kill still matters, because each one is a data point in a picture only now coming into focus. Evidence that the ecosystem hasn't simply surrendered, that predators only recently devastated by this invasion are already independently learning to fight back within their own lifetimes, rather than waiting on evolution's usual, much slower timeline. Whether that adaptation can accelerate fast enough to bend the python's reproductive curve is the question nobody can answer yet. It's the question that sends Bartoszek's team back into the water every season, checking monitors not just for pythons anymore, but for the next signal that something else in that swamp is already hunting them. Somewhere in the Everglades tonight, A cottonmouth is digesting a python whole, its stolen transmitter still quietly pulsing from inside. A king snake is testing the air for the scent of a hatchling. And not far away, another clutch of python eggs is hatching in the dark. The next round of a fight nobody has finished counting yet, and one this channel will keep following as the data comes in.